Chapter 18. Telltale Shoes. Nelda swam furiously toward the Winschoten. Every few moments she would pause and shout Nancy's name, but she received no response. The girls were not within hearing distance, and their shouts were drowned out by the roaring waves. Each hoped fervently that the other was all right. Both were shaking with cold and fear. Suddenly, their hopes were revived. The ocean liner had stopped. Someone had missed them after all. In another minute, they spotted the strong searchlight of the oncoming launch. It was headed in their direction. Both girls managed to hold up their right and left arms alternately while staying afloat so that they might be seen. The move was enough to signal their rescuers. First, the launch stopped to pick up Nelda, who was a bit closer. A crewman dropped a rope ladder over the side, and the weary swimmer grabbed it. As she climbed up, helpful arms extended to her and pulled her into the launch. "Are you all right?" a young officer asked anxiously as Nelda dropped onto the floor of the small vessel. "Yes," Nelda gasped. "Yes, I'm fine, but I don't know about Nancy. Please find her." "Don't worry, we saw her waving her arm. She'll be okay," the young man assured Nelda, and he covered the shivering girl with a blanket. "Just relax and rest a few moments." A minute later, the launch spotted Nancy, and soon she too had been hauled aboard. The young officer asked her if she felt okay. Nancy smiled wanly as she replied, "Yes, but I never want to have another experience like that again." After Nancy had been wrapped in a blanket and the launch was headed back toward the Winschoten, the officer asked the girls, "Now tell me, how did you happen to fall overboard?" "Fall?" Nancy cried out indignantly. "We were thrown into the ocean by two masked men." "What?" The officer was thunderstruck. "But who would do a thing like that?" "Well," Nancy said, "it's a long story, but we have mysterious enemies on board. We suspect they're international jewel thieves who are afraid we'll expose them." "Did you recognize the men?" the officer asked. "No, that's just it. They wore fishermen's suits and stocking masks," Nancy said. "We can't identify them because of their disguises." By this time, the launch was alongside the ocean liner. Each girl was put into a rescue chair and pulled aboard. There were hundreds of onlookers staring down from the various decks. Nancy and Nelda ignored all the questions that were shouted at them and only waved briefly to their friends to let them know they were feeling all right. Bess, George, and the four boys followed the girls, who were taken to the infirmary. While their friends waited outside, Nancy and Nelda were examined by Dr. Carl. He could not find anything seriously wrong with them. "You're pretty hardy girls," he said when he had finished. "I'm just glad the water wasn't very cold. I recommend hot baths and then to bed. Better stay here overnight and get a good rest." The girls did not object, and two nurses took charge of them. After they were tucked into beds, side by side, Captain Detweiler visited. He was very upset. "Too many strange things have happened on this trip," he said. "But this last incident is atrocious. I have instituted a thorough search for the two phony fishermen." After the captain had gone, Nelda fell asleep, but Nancy lay awake. She felt all right and wanted to get up to continue her sleuthing. It had suddenly occurred to her that perhaps she had a clue to one of the fishermen. "Anyway, I have a 2 a.m. date with Rod to carry the mystery trunk to the hold," she reasoned. When a nurse came in, she asked to see Dr. Carl. He came at once, and she told him she felt perfectly well. "Please," she said, "let my friends bring me some dry clothes. I want to go back to my own cabin." The physician smiled and said, "I'm sure that'll be all right, but you'll have to promise me that you'll take it easy." Nancy laughed. "I'll promise. One midsummer night's swim was enough for me." Nancy phoned Bess and George, who had gone to their cabin after being told that the girls would stay in the infirmary overnight. She asked them to bring dry clothes for her. "You're going to get up?" Bess asked. "Yes," Nancy replied. By this time, Nelda had awakened, and when she realized Nancy was leaving, she indicated that she wanted to go too. "Tell Bess to bring some things for me too," she said to Nancy. Bess and George arrived in a short time with fresh clothes for the two girls, and Dr. Carl released them both. They returned to cabin 128 and sat down. "One reason I wanted to come back here," Nancy explained to her friends, "is that I have a slight clue to one of the fake fishermen. He was wearing a pair of very unusual shoes. They were like Dutch wooden shoes, but made of leather." Nelda was astounded to hear this. "I didn't even notice what my attacker had on his feet," she said. George asked, "How are you going to find out who owns them?" "I'm not sure. Maybe Rod can help." Nancy called Havelock's number. Rod promised to come right down to their cabin. "You girls have made a lightning recovery," he said when he arrived. "You're amazing." Nancy told Rod she wanted him to help her hunt for a pair of shoes and describe them. "I'll ask each steward if he has seen such a pair in any of the passengers' cabins," Rod offered, and got on the telephone. He could not reach all the men and left messages for them to call him at cabin 128. It seemed a long time to the girls, and the answer from each steward was negative. None of them had seen such an odd pair of shoes in any of the cabins they serviced. Rod Havelock, too, was disappointed. Instead of leaving, he stood in the middle of the room, looking up into space. Finally, he said, "I just thought of something. It seems to me that one of the crewmen has such a pair of shoes." "Can we go and ask him now?" Nancy urged. "Yes, let's do that." Again, Nancy recalled the finger language message in which the word crew had appeared. When the two reached the crew's quarters, Rod knocked on the door of the man he had in mind. The fellow opened and asked in Dutch what Havelock wanted. Rod replied in the same language, so Nancy had to wait for a translation. She was amazed and delighted when the crewman brought out a pair of shoes just like the ones she had seen on the phony fisherman. She wanted to ask questions, but knowing that the man could not understand her, she remained silent. Havelock listened carefully to the fellow's explanation, which he translated for Nancy. A passenger borrowed his shoes for the costume party. This man here set them outside his door, and the passenger picked them up. "Who was the passenger?" "He says he can't identify him because he never saw him." The borrower had shoved a printed note under his door and requested that the crewman leave the shoes outside. Later, the shoes were returned with several guilders in them. Nancy was disappointed and asked if the man still had the printed note. Unfortunately, he had thrown it away. Havelock thanked the man for the information. Then he and Nancy walked back upstairs. For several minutes, not a word was spoken between them. Finally, Nancy remarked, "Those evil men are clever." "Yes," Rod replied. "Too bad we didn't catch them in the act." He left her at the door of 128, saying, "I'll be back for you at 2 a.m. In the meantime, you'd better catch a little sleep. You've had a harrowing evening." Nancy had every intention of following his advice, But when she stepped inside her room, she found the other girls waiting for her. They wanted to talk. "Did you have any luck?" George asked. The young detective shook her head. "Not much," she said, and told them what the crewman had said. "This is so frustrating," Bess said. "Too bad we don't have any hard evidence." "Couldn't the captain arrest August for smuggling the jewels and documents?" Nelda asked. "He can't be accused of smuggling the jewels yet. Only when he goes through customs without declaring them," Nancy said. "I don't know about the documents, but he might be able to talk his way out of that one. He could say it's not his trunk." Nancy decided not to undress, but the other girls did and got into bed. They found, however, that they could not sleep. Suddenly, Nancy thought of something. "You know," she said, "we forgot to put the paper back into the trunk." "We'd better do it now," George said. "Come on, girls, put on your robes and slippers." They jumped out of bed and a few minutes later followed Nancy into cabin 130. Once more, the strange trunk was taken from the wardrobe, set on the floor, and opened. After they had emptied the piece of luggage, Nancy said, "I really didn't examine the sides as thoroughly as the bottom and the lid. Before we put the paper back in, let me check this out." She ran her fingers all along the sides. When she came to one corner, she said, "The paper seems to come off here very easily." "Why not remove it and see what's underneath?" George suggested. Nancy did just that, and the girls stared at what she uncovered. It was a purple velvet cloth, and part of a diamond was sticking out through a small slit in it. Carefully, Nancy lifted the velvet cloth. The girls were speechless at what they saw. Below the covering was a second matching cloth. To this had been sewn rings, pins, bracelets, and tiny velvet bags containing precious jewels. Bess sighed in awe. "Oh, these are beautiful! It's a good thing we didn't miss them." Nelda ran her fingers over the stones. "I can't believe it! I just can't believe it!" Nancy spoke up. "Nelda, the bracelet you were accused of stealing, is it here?" Nelda shook her head sadly. "No." "Don't you think we should call the captain?" George suggested. "Let's ask him to come down immediately. These jewels have to be put into his safe before the trunk goes into the hold." "You're right," Nancy agreed. George went into the adjoining cabin and dialed the captain's number. "Yes?" he said. Quickly, George explained that it was imperative for him to come down to his niece's cabin at once. "Is she ill?" he asked, worried. "No, she's fine," George replied. "There's another reason. I can't tell you on the phone." "I'll be there in a few minutes," Captain Detweiler promised. The girls removed the piece with the precious stones from the trunk, but put the purple cover back in place. "It's going to be a hard job putting this paper back over the velvet," Bess remarked. Nancy nodded. "To tell you the truth," she said, "I think it's impossible." "Suppose August opens the trunk and sees what we've done. He could say he made a mistake and it isn't his," Bess said. "He has to unlock it first," George said. "And by doing that, he proves it's his, because he has the keys." "Good thinking," Nancy agreed. "Let's forget about the paper. As a matter of fact, let's rip it all out, just to make sure we didn't miss anything." This was quickly done, but nothing more was found underneath the paper on the opposite side. The girls locked the trunk again and put it back into the wardrobe. At this moment, there was a knock on the door of cabin 128. Quickly, they hurried into their room and walked up to the door together. If the person who had knocked was not the captain, they would be prepared. End of chapter 18.